If someone claims to be God, we would have strong or good reasons to believe them if they could do signs, wonders, and miracles. So, premise 2, there's good historical evidence that Jesus claimed to be God and did signs, wonders, and miracles. Therefore, the conclusion, if all this holds, is we have good reason to believe Jesus really was God. Now, we're not spending too much time on the first premise because that seems to be something that's usually affirmed even by non-Christians or skeptics. I gave you guys the example of a debate I did earlier this year with an atheist, Dan Barker, down in Florida at an atheist conference. And in the midst of that debate, he affirmed basically that miracles would be good evidence to believe that there is a God, or he didn't say it this way, but just that miracles would function as good evidence that somebody really is God or from God or has a message from God. So in the debate, if you've watched it, the example he brought up is, I was arguing with him as my opponent that there is a God, and he said, well, one of the things I think when I asked him, what would convince you that there is a God? He said, well, if you could do some sort of miracle for me. And the miracle he had in mind was predicting the future. If I could predict when a meteorite would land in his yard the next day or something, then he would consider that good evidence. But I find this to be very common among non-Christians or skeptics, that they affirm miracles would function as good evidence. So we're not going to spend much time on premise 1. The majority of our time this year we're going to spend on premise 2, and that is looking at this historical evidence that Jesus really did do these sort of miracles. Now, as I mentioned before, this isn't a new argument, okay? This argument from miracles has been around for a long time. And I gave you an example of a well-known argument put together by an Enlightenment thinker. You're probably familiar with John Locke. And he made a case for Christianity in his book, The Reasonableness of Christianity as Delivered in the Scriptures. And his primary argument was the argument that we're using this year in Ratio Christi, is he based his major argument on miracles, just like we're doing. Now, just because we believe that miracles are possible, we've talked about this, we think that miracles can happen because there is a God, and certainly if there is a God who created the universe, certainly it would be easy for him to cause someone to walk on water, or multiply loaves and bread, or loaves and fish. But that just because we believe miracles are possible, that doesn't mean we should believe every miracle claim that we hear, right? We shouldn't be gullible, in other words. We can't reject miracles as impossible if there is a God, but we don't want to go too far the other way either and be gullible and accept every miracle claim that we hear about. So we need to evaluate. There's a lot of fakes and mistakes out there. People who are faking, lying to you about having done or seen a miracle, or they're just honestly mistaken. And so we need to be a little bit more skeptical, if you will, about miracle claims. So how do we figure out if a miracle claim is actually true? How do we know when a genuine miracle has actually happened? Well, I would say it's very similar to any other supposed event that someone is proposing happened in the past. Whether they claim to have gotten a hole-in-one on the golf course or won the lottery or any event in history, right? It would be based on evidence. We would want to evaluate that based on good, reliable evidence. Is there any tangible evidence? Is there any eyewitnesses who saw this, for instance? And that's the same thing with Jesus' miracles. We need to evaluate the evidence. And this is what separates the miracle claims of Christianity from any other miracle claims throughout history. Just the amount and quality of the evidence for Jesus and the apostles' miracles far exceeds any other miracle claims, at least that I'm aware of. And I'm not the only one who says that. In fact, this point is affirmed by many non-Christians as well. Take a look at this quote from Antony Flew. Antony Flew was one of the most famous atheist philosophers in the 20th century. And even though he doesn't believe, right, that Jesus actually did miracles, he was willing to admit that the evidence is pretty impressive. So take a look at what Antony Flew wrote. He He said, the evidence for the resurrection is better than for claimed miracles in any other religion. It's outstandingly different in quality and quantity. So I'm really excited to begin this study with you guys. It's going to last for 6 weeks, 4 weeks of this semester, and then the first 2 weeks of the spring semester. And what we're going to do in order to begin evaluating this evidence for Jesus and his miracles, we are going to look at a book by an agnostic New Testament scholar. You guys might be familiar with Bart Ehrman. He's written a lot of books, but the one we're going to look at in particular is a book he titled, Did Jesus Exist? And you might wonder, the first question you might have is, why would an agnostic, somebody who doesn't believe Christianity is true, why would he even be interested in this topic, right? Why would someone like that, an agnostic, devote their entire life's work to studying the historical evidence for Jesus and studying the New Testament in particular? He's a New Testament scholar. Well, I'm going to give you some quotes from the book to start off, and you'll see from these initial quotes that he affirms something I said just a few weeks ago. Remember when we talked about Plato and Aristotle's influence on Western civilization? And I said most everybody, when they rank the individuals who have had the most influence in Western civilization, most everybody ranks Jesus as first, and then Plato and Aristotle as second and third. And Bart Ehrman is no exception to this. So, for instance, this is why he has devoted his life to studying these issues. So he wrote, one could argue as well that Jesus is the most important person in the history of the West, looked at merely from a historical, social, or cultural perspective, quite apart from his religious significance. Similarly, about the Bible, he wrote on the same page, one could easily argue that the Bible is the most important book in the history of Western civilization. What other book even comes close in terms of its historical, social, and cultural significance? Now, let me tell you, before we dive into the material in his book, just a little bit more about Bart Ehrman, if you're not familiar with him, his bio, if you will. Now, he used to be a conservative Christian. In fact, he was involved, in a sense, even in Christian apologetics at a younger age. Now in his life, and I think this happened early in his life, I don't know the exact age he was, he moved away from Christianity and even theism itself, so he refers to himself as an agnostic with atheistic leanings. I thought that was an interesting choice of words. But that's how he describes himself. He earned his PhD in New Testament studies at Princeton University under a gentleman by the name of Bruce Metzger. And that's going to be important a little bit later in the talk. So just put that in the back of your mind for now. Bruce Metzger is who he got his PhD under. Metzger is a famous Christian scholar. Ehrman, for many, many years, has been a professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and is a very well-known New Testament historian and scholar. He's written over 30 books now at both the academic level and the popular level. But the one that we're taking a look at is, Did Jesus Exist? So maybe I'll send this around. You guys can thumb through it, take a look at it if you'd like. While I'm up here blabbing away. Now, the reason we're taking a look at this book is he wrote this book, Did Jesus Exist, in particular, to respond to a group of people that he refers to as Jesus mythicists. Okay, so there are people out there who don't believe that there ever was a Jesus of Nazareth. So not only do they believe that Jesus wasn't God or did miracles, they don't even think that there was a person named Jesus who lived right in the early first century from Nazareth and so on and so forth. So he refers to these folks as Jesus mythicists, and he wrote this book in response to them to basically say, look, you guys are wrong. You might be even some of my fellow agnostics or some of my fellow atheists, but you're wrong on this particular issue. There was a historical Jesus, and here's all the evidence which have led scholars to believe that there was a Jesus of history. And so this book, 400 pages, I'm not sure exactly how long it is, lays out all the historical evidence for the existence of this person, Jesus of Nazareth. And so that's why I thought it would be helpful for us to begin our study with this particular book. I think one of the primary reasons that we would want to look at what an agnostic scholar says is for strategic purposes, right? Because like it or not, some skeptics are not open to listen, let's say, to evidence from Christian scholars because they're Christian. And so it's a strategic move, if you will, to present the same evidence, but from somebody who is not a Christian, right? I mean, I could certainly use Christian scholars to present all of this material and evidence that I'm going to present over the next 6 weeks, but I think it's more powerful, at least to some skeptics, to hear this evidence from somebody who's not themselves a Christian. Another thing that Ehrman is going to provide, which I think is really helpful for all of us to know, is just how historians go about investing history or investigating history. How do historians go about investigating and evaluating historical evidence? And I think this is very good material that we can learn from Ehrman. You may be surprised to see how much Ehrman agrees with us in affirming this evidence for the historical Jesus. Of course, probably the strongest con against this strategy is that he himself doesn't believe that Jesus is God, right? And that's our primary argument this year. So we're using material from somebody who rejects the conclusion of our primary argument. As he says, right, in the book, he's not a Christian and has no interest in promoting a Christian cause or agenda. As I said before, he describes himself as an agnostic with atheist leanings. Now, from what I understand, the reason he rejects the existence of God is mostly due to the problem of evil, okay? So we discussed more about the existence of God last year and a little bit of review earlier this year. But as I understand it, that's his primary reason for rejecting the existence of God, the problem of evil. But he does believe in and affirm a lot of this historical evidence for Jesus that we're going to look at. So I do think it's strategic and useful when we talk to skeptics, especially those who would be more readily dismissive of any evidence from Christian scholars. However, since he's obviously not a Christian, we would not be able to use his material alone to make the case that Jesus is God. So what we're going to be doing is looking at his book. I'm not going to be covering everything in his book, of course. It's 400 pages. What we're going to be focusing on is all of the evidence he presents for the historical Jesus. So really, what I'm going to be presenting is everything that Ehrman and then Christian scholars would agree on. So, but I do encourage you guys to get a hold of the book. Maybe you could even borrow it from me when we're done with this if you'd like, or buy it yourself. You can get it on Amazon very cheaply used. And I encourage you to read the entire thing. But we're just going to focus on the things that Ehrman and we would agree on in terms of evidence for Jesus. So I'll give you some examples. The way I've kind of laid this out, just so you can visualize what we're doing, we're going to be focusing from his book on the foundational evidence that all Christian and non-Christian scholars affirm, okay? So from his book, we're just going to be gleaning the basic historical evidence that everybody, whether they're a Christian or not, agrees on. And I'm talking about scholars at this point. Here's just a representative sample. You know, there's much more than this, as we'll see throughout the book, that scholars agree on. But here's just a sample of what I'm calling foundational historical facts that everybody agrees on. That Jesus lived as a Jewish man from Nazareth in the early 1st century, and he had a reputation for doing miracles. He was crucified under Pilate around AD 30. So even non-Christian scholars, including Ehrman, agree that he had a reputation for doing miracles, but they wouldn't, at least the non-Christian scholars, wouldn't affirm that he actually did supernatural miracles. So this is the foundational stuff, as I said, that everybody agrees on, and this is all we're going to be covering over the next 6 weeks, using Ehrman to do so. And then from there, of course, we'll move on to what I'm calling here, for the purposes of this slide, more level 2 facts, okay? And these would be facts that, of course, all Christian scholars would affirm, and some non-Christian scholars would also affirm. So here's an example of some of those, right? Jesus' tomb was found empty. All Christian scholars would hold to that based on historical evidence. Some non-Christian scholars would as well. Other non-Christian scholars would say, no, there's just not quite enough evidence for us to pull the trigger and affirm that one. And then that he thought of himself as God, and that the New Testament was developed by his immediate disciples. So this is, again, all Christian scholars affirm this, and some non-Christian scholars affirm it, some don't. Okay, this would be the second category, just some examples. And then lastly, you can think of building a house, right? The foundation, level 2, and then level 3 would be those things which only Christian scholars would affirm. And that is, of course, where we're going eventually this semester, to make the case, based on historical evidence, that Jesus did miracles, that he rose from the dead, and in fact, he is fully God himself. Now, obviously, to make a case for these things, we're going to have to use Christian scholars, right? But we're not just going to quote them and be done. We're going to look at the evidence which has led these particular scholars to conclude these things are true. So let me just jump forward a little bit here, and I'll give you some examples of those type of scholars that we're going to be looking at to make the case for these level 3 items. Okay, the first one is the one who Ehrman got his PhD under, right? I remember I said to put that in the back of your mind, Bruce Metzger. So Metzger was a professor at Princeton University for almost 50 years, if you can believe that. I'm sure he had some of those situations where he had students, and then he had the children of those students. And being there for 50 years, he might have even had the grandparents of some of his original, or his grandchildren of some of his original students. But very impressive. 50 years at Princeton, one of the most influential New Testament scholars of the 20th century, passed away 2007, not many years ago. Wrote over 50 books, and especially what he's really well known for is textual criticism, trying to recreate the original New Testament from the extant copies that we have. And so this work of his is very well known in the scholarly world as a resource that compiles a lot of that evidence. And he was a firmly committed Christian. And so we're going to be looking at his work to help us make the case that Jesus really did perform miracles. Another example of a Christian scholar that we'll take a look at is N.T. Wright. Now, N.T. Wright is a professor of New Testament at Oxford University, greatly respected academically, both by Christians and non-Christians. He wrote The Resurrection of the Son of God, so that is a great, I want to say 700-800 page resource that is based on historical evidence, where he makes the case Jesus rose from the dead. And that is a good resource to have, a resource you can quote in like your academic papers, right? So when you're writing papers here at the University of Nebraska, you probably shouldn't quote me or your pastor to make a point, but he would have the academic credentials as someone you could certainly quote, right? An Oxford professor. All right, 2 more Christian scholars that we'll utilize later in the semester to make a case for those level 3 items. Paul Meyer, he grew up in a Christian home, but he wanted to know if there's actually historical evidence for Jesus. So he got his master's degree from Harvard and then jumped the pond over to Europe, got his PhD there. And I believe, if he's not retired yet, he was at least for many years professor of ancient history at Western Michigan University. A good resource from him, and this would be more at the popular level, but still quotable as an academic, being a history professor at a secular public university. This would be a good resource to have. The Genuine Jesus, Fresh Evidence from History and Archaeology. And the last one, unfortunately, someone who just passed away a couple weeks ago, another Meyer, but spelled a little bit differently, John P. Meyer. He was a professor at Notre Dame, regarded as one of the leading scholars of the historical Jesus and early Christianity, authored over 70 peer-reviewed journals, articles, and wrote this massive, he was actually working on the 6th volume of this series when he passed away, so it's still to be known if it's going to be published somehow or if someone else will finish it. But A Marginal Jew, Rethinking the Historical Jesus, also an ordained Catholic priest. I knew I'd get something from Caitlin. Good representation there for you, Caitlin. But yeah, he just unfortunately passed away a couple weeks ago. Kind of sad. All right, as I said, there are some skeptics who might just dismiss anything that these guys say because they're Christians, right? However, I don't think skeptics should be too quick, and not all skeptics are like this, but some are. But I think they make a mistake when they just too quickly dismiss evidence from these scholars merely because they're Christians. Bart Ehrman certainly doesn't. Look at what Ehrman says about some of these guys. In fact, the first quote I'm going to give you from Ehrman is about this gentleman, John Meyer. So when Ehrman wrote this, he had only finished 4 of his 6-volume series. But here's what Ehrman says. In the massive and justly acclaimed 4-volume study of the historical Jesus by one of the leading scholars in the field, John Meyer, Wells, which is a guy that Ehrman talks about, one of the Jesus mythicists, John Meyer, in John Meyer's work, this mythicist, Wells, and his views are dismissed in a single sentence. But I give you this quote to show that Ehrman has a lot of respect for this New Testament scholar, even though he is a Christian. Also, look at what Ehrman says about Bruce Metzger, the guy that he studied under and got his PhD under at Princeton. This is what Ehrman wrote about Metzger. Metzger is one of the great scholars of modern times, and I dedicated the book to him, not this book, another book by Ehrman, because he was my inspiration for going into textual criticism and the person who trained me. I have nothing but respect and admiration for him. Even though we may disagree on important religious questions, he's a firmly committed Christian, Metzger. I am not. However, we're in complete agreement on a number of very important historical and textual questions. So Ehrman doesn't dismiss these guys just because they're Christians, and I don't think skeptics should either. Now, I'm going to give you another discussion question, and I'm going to ask you to think through how would you respond to this particular objection. This seems to happen every time I do this, but when I present evidence from these Christian scholars that Jesus did miracles or rose from the dead, one of the responses that I often get is, well, look, these Christian scholars, they have to affirm Jesus' miracles and his resurrection because they're Christians. They have to affirm those things. So if somebody would give you that sort of objection, how would you respond? I'll give you a few minutes. I find this to be a pretty poor objection. So to me, I think it's similar to if we theists would say something like, atheists have to affirm arguments that there is no God because they're atheists. I just think that's really poor thinking. Maybe it's the case that these atheists are atheists because they're impressed by the arguments that there is no God. It's not as though they have to accept these arguments because they're atheists. Similarly, maybe these scholars are Christians because they're impressed by the evidence for Jesus' miracles. So, flip it around. Just because we as theists shouldn't reject an argument that there is no God because it comes from an atheist, I don't think skeptics should reject a case for Jesus' miracles based on evidence just because it comes from a Christian scholar. Now, as I keep saying, all of this material and evidence I'm going to be presenting from Ehrman's book over the next 6 weeks, I could use Christian scholars to present the exact same evidence. And in an ideal world, that would be fine, but I recognize that some skeptics are going to be more likely to believe it if it's coming from Ehrman. So let me give you an example of this, all right? Here's something that was written by Ehrman. Take a look. It's kind of a long paragraph, but I'll read it here. He says, Luke's writings about Jesus carry no more or less weight than the writings of any other ancient biographer. We don't dismiss early American accounts of the Revolutionary War simply because they were written by Americans. To refuse to use them as sources is to sacrifice the most important avenues to the past we have, and on purely ideological, not historical grounds. We know about that word here at Rochelle Christi, don't we? Ideological. So too the Gospels. Whatever one thinks of them as inspired scripture, they can be seen and used as significant historical sources. Once it is conceded that the Gospels can and should be treated as historical sources, no different from other historical sources infused with authors' biases, of course, it starts to become clear why historians have almost universally agreed that whatever else one might say about him, Jesus of Nazareth lived in first century Palestine and was crucified by the prefect of Judea. Now, I could give, probably thousands of quotes like that from Christian scholars, but how much more powerful is it coming from Ehrman, an agnostic New Testament scholar? So that's why I find this to be a powerful strategy, if you will. Now, one of the things that I think is going to be really helpful for us to learn from Ehrman's book is just the process that historians like himself go through in order to evaluate historical evidence, to try to understand what really happened in the past and what didn't. So very early in his book, he points out, he says, look, I need to make a few preliminary remarks about historians and how they go establishing what probably happened in the past. Now, this next set of material I'm going to present tonight over the next 10 or 15 minutes is really difficult for, I've found, a lot of Christians, okay? Because I've found that it's difficult for some Christians to evaluate the New Testament historically as merely ancient documents. Now, the reason they struggle with this is they've come to the point in their belief system that they're convinced that the New Testament are messages from God, and so they can't be wrong, right? And so when you have that mindset, it can be difficult, I've seen, at least for some Christians, to step back from that belief that it's God's inspired word and evaluate it merely at the level of ancient documents. So evaluate it historically, as historians do. So let's say, I'm going to give you another discussion question real quick here. Let's say you're talking with a Christian like that who might have some difficulty evaluating the New Testament on a historical level as ancient historical documents because they believe it's God's word and just therefore think that there can be nothing wrong in it. How would you talk with such a Christian and try to lovingly convince them to be open to evaluating the New Testament as merely ancient documents? How I usually handle this situation, and I encounter this quite a bit, right? And I also believe that the New Testament is God's word, so I believe it can't have any mistakes or errors in it. But I think it's also important to take a step back from that and evaluate the New Testament as ancient documents that can and should be evaluated based on historical evidence. And so one of the things that I often point out to people is, look, in order to make the case that they really are messages from God, you first need to show that they're historically reliable. Because you need pieces from that, so to speak, evidence from them being historically reliable in order to make the best case that they really are from God. So you can think of it almost as a two-step process. You evaluate the New Testament documents for their historical reliability first, and then from that can make the case that they really are messages from God. So if it helps, what I encourage Christians to do is imagine that they're maybe in that process of their Christian belief system, that they're not convinced yet that the Bible really is from God, and so they're maybe evaluating it as an honest skeptic to see if it's historically reliable, because it's from that process that you'll be able to develop the tools and the data you'll need in order to make the case that it really is from God. So I think Christians should be willing and able to evaluate the New Testament books historically as ancient documents. Okay, another thing that Ehrman, I think, covers that's very helpful is to understand the limits of historical investigation. Okay, and this is something you hear from me a lot, so I think it's good to also hear it from Ehrman as well. Because he makes the case, even as a historian, that there are limits, right, to historical investigation. One of the things he notes, and I agree with him, is that historical knowledge can never be as certain, for instance, as scientific knowledge, because, for the simple fact that historical events can't be repeated, right? We can't study Abraham Lincoln's assassination under a microscope, right? We can't perform that experiment to see if we get the same results. History just doesn't work like that. And this is true of anything of history, right? So it's not ever going to be, let's say, as certain as scientific knowledge. That's one of the reasons why everybody agrees that scientific knowledge is one of the most certain forms of knowledge that we have, because it can be repeated and observed in the scientific method, so on and so forth. So what historians have to look for then, since they just can't repeat experiments to confirm things, they have to look for other forms of evidence. For instance, eyewitness testimony, written sources, archaeological artifacts, so on and so forth. Another thing he notes throughout the book is that we're never going to be able to achieve absolute certainty in our historical knowledge, right? So he wrote here, these evidence-based criterion that we're going to go over shortly to try to determine what really happened in history, these criterion historians use, are designed to consider probabilities, not certainties, not absolute certainties. Because this is all the historian can do, establish what probably happened in the past. To demand a criterion that yields certainty is to step outside the historical research. All we can establish are probabilities. Now, I don't prefer that term, probabilities, and this probably just comes from me being a former statistician, working with probability theory in actuarial science. I tend to think, and I think it's probably better to use the term probability when we're discussing future events, like what's probably going to happen tomorrow, or if I roll a dice, let's say, what are the probabilities of getting different numbers on that dice. So I think it's best to use the term probability to talk about future events, because the way that I think of it, at least, is things in the past either happened or they didn't. It's not that they probably happened or they probably didn't happen. No, either they did or they didn't. So I would prefer to use the phrase degrees of certainty, because then we're talking not about the events themselves, because the events either happened or they didn't, but we're talking more about our ability to be certain or not certain, or how certain can we be of something that happened in history. So I prefer to use the term degrees of certainty. So if we have the more evidence we have, then we can have a higher degree of certainty. If we don't have as much evidence, a lower degree of certainty. That's how I prefer, those are the terms that I prefer to use in these conversations. And Ehrman uses that term as well, right? And we'll see this throughout his book. But for instance, here, page 288, he wrote, "As I have stressed throughout this book, doing history, at least ancient history, means abandoning any type of absolute certainty. But even though we can rarely be completely certain about a past event, some things are far more certain than others." So he also uses this language of degrees of certainty. And I just think that's a better term for it, the idea, the concept he's getting at, than the term probabilities. Okay, so let's get to it then. What are the criteria, and we've seen him talk about it, or mention it a few times already, but what are these criteria which leads a historian to be more certain that a historical event actually happened? So he wrote, for instance, "Scholars have devised criteria for detecting historically authentic tradition." Now, don't get hung up in that word tradition. I think a lot of people see that word or hear that word and they immediately think legend or myth, right? But at least in these conversations, when historians are talking about traditions, they're talking about what people were saying, right? So if you have a source, right, eyewitness testimony or a written source, for instance, and it says something, then that's just called tradition. It's not immediately, when they use that term, they're not immediately saying that it's false. It's just a tradition. It's just a saying. It's just what people were saying. But then what are the criteria to know whether what they were saying was what really happened or if they made it up? Okay, does that make sense? Don't get thrown off by the term tradition. So these criteria apply, in fact, to any figure of the past described in any sort of kind of historical source. So the more of these criteria that a particular event meets, then the more certain we can be that the event actually happened. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to discuss this now. What do you think some of these criteria might be? We're going to cover them with the remainder of the time we have left tonight, but brainstorm a little bit right now. Put yourself, in the role of a historian, and what would make you more certain that an actual event of history really happened? Okay, well, we're just going to run through. There's several of these criteria, as you can imagine, and we're going to use Ehrman's book and let him kind of give us a rundown of the major criteria that historians use. And as I overheard your discussion at your table, a lot of you were mentioning these things, so that's good. I'm glad you guys are on the right track. So probably the most important criteria is that there are multiple sources, right? So here you got Ehrman, and he wrote, "Historians prefer to have lots of written sources, not just one or two. The more, obviously, the better. If there were only one or two sources, you might suspect that the stories are made up, although," and I think it's good for him to make this point, "you would probably want to have some reasons for thinking so. But if there are lots of sources, just as when there are lots of eyewitnesses to a car accident, it's hard to claim that any one of them just happened to make it all up." So obviously, the more sources you have, the higher degree of certainty you can reach that the event really happened. And I think it's good of him to use a car accident as an example, and I'll use that throughout the night. He does a few times in the book. But just think about a car accident, right? If you only have one witness to a car accident, that's not as good, let's say if you were the investigating insurance agent or something. What you would prefer, right, to know more about the car accident is to have multiple eyewitnesses who saw the accident, right? So the more, the better. Now, I do like that he made the point, you can't dismiss something if there are few sources. You can't dismiss something just because there are few sources, right? It might just be the happenstance of history that we only have one source, right? So go back to the car accident again. It might be the case that there was only one eyewitness, or you might be only able to track down one of the eyewitnesses. If 10 did see it, maybe you're just restricted by only being able to talk to one of them. You can't dismiss everything they said as false just because there's only one source. It's just, again, it's degrees of certainty. The more eyewitnesses, the more sources you have, the better. I think that's pretty common sense. He makes this point elsewhere. He says, just because a tradition, again, information, tradition, information, is found in one source, and one source only, does not necessarily mean it's unreliable. But if there's no corroboration elsewhere, we can say it's at least suspect. We could be more certain if there were more sources. For example, he gives this example later in the book. He says, we're fairly certain Jesus had sisters, even though that's just mentioned in one source, right? So you might be familiar in Mark chapter 6, it's mentioned that Jesus had sisters. And he said, we only have one source from the first century that says he had sisters, but it's not something that we would think people would want to make up. And so he thinks we can be fairly certain that he in fact did have sisters, okay? However, historians are much more confident, much more certain that Jesus had physical brothers, because we know that from multiple sources. So again, it's just degrees of certainty based on how many sources say the same thing, that corroborate one another, okay? Now, of course, another important criteria are that these sources are independent, okay? So Ehrman wrote, at the same time, it's important to know that the various sources are independent of one another and do not rely on each other for all of their information. Go back to the car accident example, right? If Mike saw the car accident and told Sarah, right, his friend, we don't have two independent sources at that point, Mike and Sarah, because Sarah got all of her information from Mike. In that situation, we still just have one independent source, right? But if Mike and Sarah were both there and they both saw the car accident, then we would have two independent sources. I'm sure that makes sense. The third criteria is corroborating sources. Noted this a little bit already, but he goes into more detail here. Ehrman wrote, moreover, in an ideal situation, the various sources that discuss a figure or an event should corroborate what each of the others has to say, at least in the major points, if not in all the details. So you can think up, a couple examples of this. Go back to Mike and Sarah, right? If Mike says that, yeah, in this accident, the car flipped over 10 times, caught on fire, and just a big ball of flames, right? But then Sarah says, no, it was just a little fender bender, and everybody drove away, and it was fine. It was no big deal. Well, then you would be suspicious of at least one of them, right? Because the stories aren't corroborating. However, and I think Ehrman makes a good point here, that if some of the detail is different, that wouldn't necessarily cause us to reject it. So, classic example, the guy, let's say, gets the color of the car wrong. Let's say the guy says it's black, whereas Sarah is actually accurate, and she says the car was dark blue, right? This would not be such different information that it would cause us to reject the accounts, right? That would be a minor detail that would not cause us to accuse either one of them of lying. So overall, corroborating on at least the major points of the story, right? Okay, number 4, early sources. I heard a lot of you, the different tables, bring this up. So Ehrman wrote, historians also prefer to have sources that are relatively near the date of the person or event they are describing. As time goes on, things do get made up. And so it's much better to have near contemporary accounts. If not made up, then just forgotten. I mean, we're all human and fallible, right? So if our first reports, for example, about Moses comes from 600 years after he allegedly lived, those reports would not nearly be as trustworthy as reports that can plausibly be dated to 6 years after he lived. The closer in temporal proximity, the better. So go back to the car accident example. If we have some sort of data or tradition or information from Mike and Sarah where they're maybe telling us about the accident 50 years later, an accident they saw maybe in their childhood, or they're writing it down 50 years after the fact, that would not be as preferable as if they were describing it the next day or the next year, right? So again, it's just degrees of certainty. The earlier, the better. Now somebody can lie the very second after an event happens, right? It doesn't mean just because it's early, it's true, but that's helpful because the longer time goes on, people can forget or make up things as they use their imagination or think how stories might be more beneficial for themselves. Because that's usually what we lie about, is to give us some sort of an advantage, right? All right, number 5, extensive sources, right? This is an important criterion that historians look for. So number 5, Ehrman wrote, historians also like these numerous and early sources to be extensive in scope. If all you have is the mere mention of a person's name in a source, that's not nearly as good as having long and extensive stories told in lots of ancient sources. So imagine, go back to the car accident, right? If Mike and Sarah could give you all sorts of detail about the cars that were involved, the colors of the car, the weather, the speed that they were traveling, the people who were involved, the exact time it happened, right? The place where the accident took place, all that stuff, versus if all we have from Mike and Sarah is that 2 cars crashed, right? Historians would prefer the sources to be more extensive. The more, the better, of course. And again, all of these things add up. The more you have of each one of them, the more certain you can be that something actually happened in history. Okay, the last one, and definitely the most controversial, is non-biased sources. So take a look at what Ehrman wrote about this 6th one here. It's obviously best, he wrote, if these extensive stories are reported in sources that are disinterested. That is to say, if someone's biased toward the subject matter, the bias has to be taken into account. The problem, of course, is that most sources are biased. If they didn't have any feelings about the subject matter, they wouldn't be talking about it. But if we find stories that clearly do not serve, and this is key, if we find stories that clearly do not serve the purpose of the person telling the story, we have a good indicator that these stories are reasonably unbiased, disinterested. And then we have more reason to believe they're really true. So this one definitely is the most controversial of the 6, and I want to give you some time at your tables to talk about why that might be the case. Why do you think this criteria is the one that's most debated and is so controversial? Well, sometimes this criterion, I don't know what's plural and singular here, sometimes this particular one, this non-biased sources, sometimes it's referred to as the criterion of dissimilarity, okay? The criterion of dissimilarity. Now, Ehrman agrees, I think everybody agrees, that this 6th criterion is the most controversial. So take a look at what he wrote here. He said the most controversial criterion that scholars use to establish historically probable traditions about Jesus is the criterion of dissimilarity. This criterion is rooted in the idea that the biases of a source and those of the source behind the source need to be taken into account. Now, the reason why this last one, this 6th criterion, non-biased sources, criterion of dissimilarity, one of the reasons it's so difficult to apply, and that's what makes it controversial, is it's difficult to apply because it involves trying to evaluate and know somebody's motives, right? And you know how difficult that can be, right? I mean, most of the time, I don't even understand what my own motives are for doing things, right? I used to think naively that I'm doing these good things and my motives, I'm doing these good things, and isn't that so good? But then I come to find out later, discover more about your internal workings, that the reason I was doing those good things were for evil motives, right? And so it's a process sometimes of learning what our own motives are. It's difficult to even know what our own motives are, much less try to evaluate somebody else's motives. I think that can be very, very difficult and speculative then, right? And that's why it's so controversial and difficult to apply. Well, Ehrman explains, I think well, how this criterion is applied to studying the historical evidence for Jesus. So take a look what he wrote here. He said this principle, we're talking about criterion of dissimilarity. That's what this principle is called. If there's a tradition that does not coincide with what we know about the concerns, interests, and agenda of the early Christian communities, or in fact stands at odds with these concerns, then that tradition is more likely to be authentic than a saying that does coincide with the community's interests. Now this is a bit conceptual, but to try to wrap your mind around what he's saying here, let's go back to that car accident, right? So let's say Mike is one of our eyewitnesses at the car accident, okay? However, let's also say that it was his wife that was involved in the car accident. And he says that it was his wife's fault. The accident was his wife's fault. Now, it would be unlikely that Mike would lie about that, right? Because that's going to be disadvantageous for him if his wife is at fault, because then they would have, they would be on the hook, right, financially to pay it, or the deductibles at least for the insurance, right? So it would be unlikely for him to lie about that. And again, see, this is difficult because we're trying to ascertain Mike's motives here, but what we might not know is that they're about to get divorced, let's say, and he wants to make his wife look as bad as possible. Possibility, right? That's what makes this criterion so difficult. It's because you're trying to figure out what somebody's motives might be. But it's reasonable to think that at least most spouses would not want their spouse to be the cause of the accident, so you would think it would be something he would be unlikely to lie about, right? It's unlikely he would lie because that would mean negative consequences for him. And we don't, that's not why we lie, right? We don't lie to make ourselves look bad or to bring negative things into our life. That's not why we lie, right? We lie to make ourselves look better. We lie to bring advantageous things into our life, right? So again, this is kind of the game you have to play in trying to understand motives here. And detectives do this, judges, attorneys, ulterior motives, sometimes it's called, right? But it's tricky. It's very, very difficult. It's definitely not as easy to apply as the other 5 criterion, okay? So let me give you another example from Ehrman here, going back to the historical Jesus study. Ehrman wrote that it's highly improbable that the earliest Palestinian Jewish followers of Jesus would have made up the claim that the Messiah was crucified. Okay? This would be very problematic for them. Nobody would ever lie about that. So this passes the criterion of dissimilarity. If what we want are strong probabilities, this is a highly probable tradition. Jesus was crucified. So again, the reason why this would be problematic and just Jewish people would not invent this idea or lie about this, because the Messiah, in Jewish thinking at least, was supposed to be this victorious conqueror. And so you would never make up, if you wanted to make up a Messiah that looked great, you would never have him be crucified. So this is Ehrman applying this criterion of dissimilarity to this idea that Jesus was crucified. And he's using this to come to a stronger certainty that Jesus really was crucified, because the Jews in the first century would not make up something like that, according to Ehrman. Now, go back to the car accident example as we wrap this up. We just got about 10 minutes left tonight. Go back to the car accident. Now, what if, go back to Mike and his wife was involved in the accident, but what if Mike says that it wasn't his wife's fault? Now, this would be more advantageous to him. Let's just say it's a normal situation and he doesn't want the financial burden of his wife being in a car accident or being the cause of a car accident. So he's motivated. We understand that he's motivated to say that it's not his wife's fault. So if he says that then, that it wasn't his wife's fault, should we conclude from that he's lying? Not necessarily. This is another tricky part about the criterion of dissimilarity. It can't be used to argue for the negative, right? Does that make sense? Let Ehrman give you a longer example here, going back to the historical Jesus, okay? So, Ehrman says, and I agree with him, that it's a misuse of this criterion of dissimilarity to use it to show what did not happen in the life of Jesus. And I see this misused many times by skeptics. The criterion is, so I'm glad Ehrman is making this point. The criterion is designed to be used as a positive guide to what Jesus really said and did and experienced, not as a negative criterion to show what he did not. That is to say, suppose Jesus in the Gospels predicts that he will go to Jerusalem and be crucified and then raised from the dead. Would this prediction pass the criterion of dissimilarity? Absolutely not. This is something that the community of Christians may well have wanted to put on Jesus' lips. They would have reason to make this up, right? Because it would make Jesus look better. Since it doesn't pass the criterion of dissimilarity, we can't use this to indicate that Jesus really made this prediction. But can we use it to say that he didn't make the prediction? Absolutely not. Once again, the criterion may make us suspicious, and that's appropriate. And I think all he means here by suspicious is that it can't increase our level of certainty, right? In fact, that's exactly what he says here. The criterion may make us suspicious of this or that tradition, but it cannot demonstrate on its own merits whether or not it's historical. In other words, by its very character, this criterion does not and cannot indicate what Jesus did not do or say, only what he did do or say. Now, as I say, I see this mistake by skeptics very often. They use the criterion of dissimilarity to try to make the case of what Jesus didn't do. So just a simple thing is his miracles. So they will say something, well, of course his followers wanted or wished or hoped that he did miracles because that would be better for them. They're just starting a new religion. Of course, they would be motivated to make up these stories, and so therefore they must be false, right? But that is using the criterion of dissimilarity, as Ehrman says, you cannot do. You can't use it to show what Jesus didn't do or didn't say. It's only useful when you have something that is dissimilar, that you can use as positive evidence for what he did actually do or say. So I hope that makes sense. That might be one you have to chew on a little bit to really grasp, but I think it's important to understand and make that point. Okay, the last couple things that I want to do with you tonight, we just got a few minutes left here. One thing that I need to, I think, just clarify for people is how historians think. This is how most people believe historians think. Most people think that historians are judging things or judging individual sources. So they tend to think of, okay, historians, they make a list of sources, right? The Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of Mark, Gospel of John, Galatians, Gospel of Thomas, 2 Peter. They make a list of 100 sources, whatever, right? And then they evaluate things on a source-by-source level, each source at a time. So they might say one source is very historically reliable. Another source, maybe historically, or some of it's historically reliable, definitely not all of it. Some sources would not be historically reliable at all, right, as we would imagine historians making this list. But this is not normally how historians process things, okay? They don't usually evaluate things at a source-by-source level, okay? This is usually how historians think, okay? They judge, they're looking at things, events or sayings. And I think this is what especially confuses a lot of Christians sometimes, where they'll hear historians talk about how maybe this verse or that verse, there's a lot of historical evidence for that, or we're very confident that that actually happened in history, but then a historian will say the very next verse, we're not as certain that that really happened. And so I think a lot of Christians hear that and they're like, well, what? I mean, that's just the very next verse. Why think that one, why not be as confident about that one as he did the previous verse? But that's just not how historians think. That's not how they're processing these things, okay? And this will make some sense if you think about it for a bit, right? What they're more processing is at the individual event level or even down to the individual saying level. So instead, for instance, they'll take an event, Jesus was crucified, and then they'll run it through those criterion, right? How many early sources do we have that say this, right? Anything that has to do with the criterion of dissimilarity, early sources, independent sources, multiple sources, but they'll take this event and run it through multiple sources. And then that will, as we've seen already, Ehrman has said that all scholars affirm that Jesus was crucified. So they see that they have a high degree of certainty when it comes to whether or not that event happened in history. But then there's some other ones, for instance, at the event level or the sayings level, that they have very low certainty that actually happened. Maybe it's because there's not as many sources. We've talked about Jesus having brothers versus sisters, all those examples. So it's not that they're rejecting that completely, but since we don't have multiple sources, we don't have multiple independent early sources, we're just not as confident about some of those other things, right? And Ehrman explains this, right? He wrote all of the traditions, information, in these sources about Jesus, in short, need to be considered in detail on a case-by-case basis to determine if they pass the various criteria, and to see if there are other historical grounds for either affirming or denying their historical probability. So it's just, if it helps, just go back to that issue with Jesus having sisters versus having brothers, right? It's not that historians are saying he didn't have sisters, but since we only have that from one independent early source, we're just not as confident about that as historians as confident as we are about him having physical brothers, just because we have so many more sources that say it. And that's just how historians function in this. So let's wrap this up for tonight. We just got 3 minutes left. Time keeps running down. I guess that's how time works. Based on all these criteria, then, let's end with this. Based on all these criteria of historical investigation, what is in that foundation, right? If you remember the foundation and level 2, level 3, like we're building a house, right? What are all the facts, at least the ones that Ehrman talks about in this book, that fit into that category, that foundational category that all scholars affirm, right? The highest degree of certainty that we can reach, at least when it comes to first century history, okay? Ehrman spells this out. Kind of a long paragraph, but I'll read it quickly here. He says, there's a number of important facts about the life of Jesus that virtually all critical scholars agree on, for reasons that have been in part shown and that in other ways will become increasingly clear throughout the course of this chapter and the next. Everyone, except the mythicists, of course, his main people that he's interacting with in this book are the mythicists who don't think that there was a historical Jesus. Hardly any scholars would affirm that. Everyone, except the mythicists, of course, agree that Jesus was a Jew who came from northern Palestine, Nazareth, and lived as an adult in the 20s of the Common Era. He was at one point in his life a follower of John the Baptist. He became a preacher, a teacher to the Jews in the rural areas of Galilee, preached a message about the kingdom of God, and did so by telling parables, gathered disciples, developed a reputation for being able to heal the sick and cast out demons. The very end of his life, probably around 30 Common Era, 30 AD, 32, possibly 33, he made a trip to Jerusalem during a Passover feast and roused opposition among the local Jewish leaders who arranged to have him put on trial before Pontius Pilate, who ordered him to be crucified for calling himself the King of the Jews. Nearly all critical scholars agree, at least on those points, about the historical Jesus. So this is the foundation that we're going to be talking about over the next 6 weeks. Why have scholars come to be very certain about these particular foundational facts that all scholars agree on, right? Now you could say, well, give me the list of scholars, right? Give me all the scholars that do this, and I want to see every single one of them and what they say. And you might push Ehrman back on this, but I don't know how proper that would be. I mean, there's a sense in which, look, if you worked in this field for 40 years, I would guess that he has a pretty good handle on what scholarship affirms across the board, right? So I think, pressing him for a list of all these scholars, when he says, all scholars agree on these facts, I don't think it's very realistic or even appropriate to push back and ask for, the list of all the thousands of scholars. This is just how experts talk in the field, right? It's the same thing with evolution, right? I mean, we know that the vast majority, virtually all scholars that work in biology affirm that macroevolution is true. We don't need to see a list of all of them. We just know that. And I think it's appropriate to talk that way. So Ehrman makes a good point, right? This is the last slide for the night. We'll be done. He makes a good point here. What does it mean to say that all scholars agree? That by itself doesn't make it true, right? It doesn't make it true with evolution. It doesn't make it true with this historical facts that all scholars agree on about Jesus. Just because all the experts say it doesn't make it true, right? That's his point, and I agree with him. So he wrote, the view that Jesus existed is held by virtually every expert on the planet. That in itself is not proof, of course. Expert opinion is, at the end of the day, still opinion. But why would you not want to know what experts have to say? When you make a dental appointment, don't you want your dentist to be an expert? So I think his point here is just what I said before, that when experts in their field say this, I think we can take them at face value. So all scholars agree on these points. I think what that implies, when somebody says that, all scholars agree on these 5 facts or 10 facts. When somebody says something like that, and if it's true, virtually all scholars agree to these things, what that implies is that there must be good evidence, right, that would lead all scholars, both Christian and non-Christians, to hold that these things actually happen in history. And it's that evidence that we need to look at, because it's the evidence that leads us, or should lead us, to our conclusions, not if necessarily experts say it or not. We need to look at the evidence that have led the scholars and the experts to their conclusions. And that's what we'll do over the next 6 weeks, is using Ehrman to look at this evidence for these foundational facts. But it's 8:32, and you guys did a great job listening tonight, so we'll wrap it up there. Thank you.